Welcome to Foundations of Computational and Systems Biology. This course has many numbers. we'll explain all the differences and similarities, but there are three undergrad course numbers, which are all similar in content: 736, 2390, 6802, and then there are four graduate versions. The 791, 2490, and HST versions are all very similar, basically identical, but the 6874 has some additional AI content that we'll discuss in a moment. Okay, so make sure that you are registered for the appropriate version of this course. And please interrupt with questions at any time. The main goal today is to kind of give an overview of the course, both the content as well as sort of the mechanics of how the course will be taught.
I don't want to make anyone jealous who came before, but I think we can say pretty safely that we saved one of the best for last, right? I won't say the best, okay? All right. So as you can see, throughout the course, we looked at these issues about how language, race, ethnicity, gender, how they can be used to create various hierarchies. And as you can see now, after this semester, these are tools, really. They're not inherently part of who we are, but they are tools that various poles of power use to keep control, to create hierarchies. And I think last week you guys had a very good discussion with Dr. Alleman about how sometimes these hierarchies can be internalized. So is there any way to prove that pigeons never existed, or can they only not be proven to exist? So actually, I think this question hinges on the way you on what you mean by pigeons, what is meant by pigeons, right? So they just wanted to define pigeons, which is to say that they are these systems of communication which are created when people come from different language background and they have to communicate, they have to speak to each other. So like in Africa, in Asia, in fact, the term pigeon arose in the coast of China, and it referred to this business language that people use to cross linguistic barriers.
Good afternoon. Congratulations for braving it through what's now become a weekly snow disaster. This week's maybe 3 of them or something. My name's John Gabrielli. This is Introductory to Psychology, 900. This is a course about you. Okay? The entire course is what do we understand in a scientific way about human nature? How people's minds work, how people's brains work that supports their minds. This entire course is about what's a scientific way to understanding how people feel, think, and act in the world. And so we're going to try to say that we constantly think, you must in your everyday life, think about, why do you have your preferences, your desires, what's easy for you, what's hard for you, what's delightful for you.
What's happened over the past 10, 15 years is that, well, let me back up and say 15 years ago, there were people say, oh, I'm doing Six Sigma or I'm doing Lean. It was like there were two camps. And luckily that eventually we got past that. And most organizations now pick some portions of Lean, some portions of Six Sigma, and bring them together. We think of Lean as sort of optimizing flow, and Six Sigma as reducing variation. And the body of knowledges have come together into something that's generally called Lean Six Sigma. There are books you can buy called Lean Six Sigma.
So in the 70s, there were not genome sequences available or large sequence databases of any sort, except there were starting to be some protein sequences. And early computational biologists focused on comparing proteins, understanding their function, structure, and evolution. And so in order to compare proteins, you need an amino acid substitution matrix, a matrix that describes how often one amino acid is substituted for another. And Margaret Bayhoff was a pioneer in developing these sorts of matrices. And some of the matrices she developed, the PAM series, are still used today. And we'll discuss those matrices early next week.
I think the best way to proceed is in a seminar is for you to say what you're interested in. I'll see if I have some way of reacting to it. Lots of things I could talk about. I mean, one thing we could talk about related is right in the headlines. So there are things which is an opening for things we can do. That's the plan that was just announced, that made public yesterday, to deport Haitians back to Haiti from Boston. So, that's a very live issue. A lot of lives depend on it. We can do something about it right here if we want.
So there's a beautiful thesis that was done. Actually, it's huge. It's 6 volumes, and it's called the Atlas of Aviation Creole. So it's online. So I'll be happy to share the reference with you. I mean, actually, not only it has maps, it also has recordings. You can actually go and listen to the various dialects of Aviation Creole. And what people have found striking is the fact that in terms of variation, it's quite restricted. So anywhere you are in Haiti, you can speak to someone who speaks Creole if you speak Creole. So there'll be some words that are kind of shibboleth of certain regions, but overall, there is no issue with mutual understanding.
So, everybody who's works a certain field thinks that their field is really, really, really special, right? So here's why psychology is really, really, really special. So it's really, really special, I think most of all, because every endeavor that we undertake at a university or in society as a whole, it's about people, right? Except for when we think about the rest of nature. But, people study biology, chemistry, and physics. And they think, right, that the sun orbits the Earth for some period of time, and then they think it's the other way around currently, right? Okay, so people come up with these conclusions, even though we're trying to understand nature. It's people who make certain investments in economics or behave in a certain way or vote in a certain way.
So what we're going to do now, actually in 2 parts, one before lunch, one after, is introduce you to the basics of that way of thinking. So that's why we call this module Lean Thinking. What we're going to do first is talk about processes. And if lean thinking has one really important component, like if you walk away from here with one idea in your head, it's to think about work as a process, which can be improved. So we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about what is a process, how can we think about processes, how can we map processes.
So in the 2000s, definitely genome sequencing became very fashionable, as you can see here. And the genomes of now larger organisms, including human, became possible to sequence them. And then this introduced a huge host of computational challenges in assembling the genomes, annotating the genomes, and so forth. And we'll hear from Professor Gifford about some genome assembly topics, and annotation will come up throughout. Okay. Actually, let's just mention this is Jim Kent, who's sort of the guru, did the first human genome assembly that was widely used, and also involved in UCSC. And here, Ewan Burney is sort of started Ensemble and continues to run it today.
So the U.S. laws were based on the concept of one drop of blood. None of this means anything. You know, from a biological point of view, it's all totally meaningless. But these are socially constructed categories, and one drop of blood meant if you, by whatever category was concocted, you had one drop of Negro blood, you're black. And then you can't marry a white. Those were laws that were not struck down, I think, until 1967. I mean, you see it all over the place right now. I mean, it's right in front of us all over. In fact, if you look at Afro-American history in the United States, it's pretty remarkable. In fact, that's something that really should be studied.
When I'm comparing French and Latin, it's exactly what other linguists do when they compare, say, Haitian Creole to other languages. They pick a small set of patterns, and they say, well, look, this set of patterns make Creole look really special. So now I'm picking this set of patterns, actually, which are very fundamental to the grammar of any language, right? Which is the order of words. So, so scrambling is a technical term. So if that means that, any of you know German? Who knows German? You know German, okay, so. Okay, you can. So German has this property that you can pronounce. If you say, I don't know, Mary loves pancakes, right? You can move things around.
So my only goal today is to try to convince you in a number of different ways that we're not simple video camera in our minds, between our ears, recording the world in some objective, simple way. That even the simplest, most obvious things are interpretations of the world around us at many different levels of thought and feeling and perception. And that our minds, the way our minds are constructed, determines the world that we experience, that we see, that we act upon. And even very simple things that we think are pretty objective and simple, right in front of our eyes, are determined by inferences and deductions that our mind makes, weighing sources of evidence in the world and coming to conclusions about what's around us, what we hear and what we see, and how we think.
Going to look at the fundamental lean principles of Womack and Jones, which are essentially how can we think about improving a process in a kind of an organized way. And then we're going to walk through a set of tools which over the course of the next couple days we'll dive deeper into. For now, we will, with the exception of mapping, which we're actually going to do in some detail, we'll walk through the tools relatively quickly just to sort of give you an introduction to them. Again, those will be reinforced as the course goes on. So what do we mean by a process? Simply put, it's an action or a series of actions that transforms something.
Systems biology was also really sort of born around, around 2000 roughly. A very prominent example would be the development of the first gene regulatory network models that describe sea urchin development here by Eric Davidson, as well as a whole variety of models of other gene networks in the cell that control things like cell proliferation, apoptosis, et cetera. Okay. At the same time, a new field of synthetic biology was born with the development of some of the first completely artificial gene networks that would then program cells to perform desired behaviors.
Racism is kind of an underlying phenomenon, but it surfaces when you have to blame somebody. And there's very interesting work on this. If you haven't seen it, there's a really fine book by a sociologist named Arlie Hochschild. I forget exactly what it's called, but she's a Berkeley University of California sociologist, comes from a liberal background. She really wanted to understand, see if she could understand what has always been regarded as a strange paradox, that the people who are suffering the most from these neoliberal policies are the ones who most support them. It's very striking when you look. We saw it in the last election, in fact.
I want to start with a small puzzle, if I can get this thing to work. This is satellite capture of carbon monoxide plumes globally. I'll let this run for a while, and I'll show you another one that's got more information but harder to read. So the question is, why? Why are they where they are? Which requires you to first figure out where carbon monoxide comes from, which I figure most of you probably know. Quick response. How do you get carbon monoxide in the atmosphere in quantity?
Let's start with seeing. If your vision is reasonable, we say if we see something, we believe it, right? So let's start with something very simple. These lines. So one of the tough things about psychology is ever since the internet came into existence, people know every cool thing there is to know, right? Okay. So I can tell you, when I began teaching, like people say, "Oh my gosh, I've never seen such a thing. It's unbelievable," And then now it's like 2/3 of the class go, "Yeah, I've got that, on my computer at home." We did that in like 3rd grade or whatever. So all I'm saying is enjoy the ones you haven't seen before. Don't ruin it for your neighbors today, because it's harder and harder to surprise the world in a nice way, right?
So let's talk about a customer a little bit. What happens to the outputs of a process? They go to a customer. Again, just like supplier, the terminology we've got to be careful not to get too hung up on. Customer may be a customer in the sort of retail sense, somebody who buys something, or it may be somebody else who gets value out of the process. So external customers are really that retail customer. The customer is the people who pay for the process to take place. They may or may not be the end user.
what genes are present, so tools for annotating genomes, what regulatory circuitry is encoded. You'd like to be able to eventually look at a genome, understand all the regulatory elements, and be able to predict that there's some feedback circuit there that responds to particular stimulation, that responds to light or nutrient deprivation or whatever it might be. Can the transcriptome be predicted from the genome? This is sort of a long-standing question. The translatome, if you will, let's say the proteome can be predicted from the transcriptome in the sense that we have a genetic code and we can look up those triplets.
The problem is the people behind us. The federal government, its role is to take those people who are behind us, who don't want to work, who are worthless and so on, and the federal government takes them and puts them in front of us with affirmative action programs and soup kitchens and things like that. I mean, it's all a complete fantasy, but this is the way people see the world. And you can understand why they see the world that way. These are people who heard Ronald Reagan, an extreme racist, incidentally, give his disquisitions about welfare queens driving in limousines to the welfare office, black, of course, to pick up your hard-earned money.
If you're in Africa, you're kind of short of domesticated animals, and so on. If you look across pre-industrial economies and you ask what do their energy systems look like, they're going to differ depending on available resources. They're going to differ depending on climate. Do you really need to heat? Is it really important? They're going to differ level of technology, which varied a lot in pre-industrial times, particularly because communication was slow and erratic, and the level of organization, right? When the Roman Empire fell, energy systems changed, organization changed. So I'm sure there are other differences.
Our visual system, we're ludicrously off. We'll be constantly walking into walls and falling out windows and things like that, right? If we were misestimating at that length. So the idea where we have visual illusions, and I'll show you some more that I think you'll be impressed by, it's not that our visual system is messed up or that psychologists think it's hilarious to trick us. It's that lots of things our visual system is brilliant at, but it's brilliant by having certain laws or principles that it follows. And we can show that it's following those principles by seeing that when we mess with the typical circumstances, those principles calculate the wrong answer.
So how do we visualize a process? Very general question. A good method is process mapping, is to try to get our brains wrapped around what goes on inside our work process through a simple map. There's a couple of examples here. This one is close to my heart. This is an aerospace engineering drawing release process. This is A before lean. It's actually, from an engineering point of view, simple process. But when you map it out in the sort of legacy state, it doesn't look so simple. In fact, it looks very confusing.
Can protein function be predicted from sequence? So this is a very very classical problem, but there are a number of new and interesting developments as that sort of result from a lot of this high throughput data generation, both in nucleic acid sequencing as well as in proteomics. Can evolutionary history be reconstructed from sequence? Again, this has been a long-standing goal of the field, and a lot of progress has been made here. And now most, evolutionary classifications are actually based on molecular sequence at some level, and new species are often defined based on sequence. Okay. Other motivating questions. So, what would you need to measure if you wanted to discover the causes of a disease, the mechanisms of existing drugs, metabolic pathways, and microorganisms? This is sort of a systems biology question.
For one thing, there's no America. There's many splits, and some of the splits are quite sharp. In fact, this country has become polarized in the last 50 years to an extent that's never happened before. In fact, just take a look at the two political parties. Up until the 1960s, the parties weren't all that different. You couldn't distinguish a moderate Republican from a liberal Democrat. They're more or less alike. And by now, the parties are so differentiated that literally people don't intermarry across parties. And it's become literally, there's some good studies of it. And what actually happened is it's connected with race.
Greenhouse gases are a global issue. They're a set of international institutions and regimes, the World Trade Organization, climate agreements, NAFTA, et cetera, that affect the global system. They're international energy markets, international financial markets, and transnational multinational firms that link the global markets. So we don't have a single world energy market, and that'll become clear as we go through the course, but we do have a lot of linkages between national markets. So let's look first at what's the world look like in aggregate? What does the US look like in the world? And we'll look at some differences.
So one of the themes we'll talk about a lot in the course is both an amazing power of the human mind and an amazing peril of the human mind, and it's what psychologists call automaticity. It's that our mind, in order to be efficient and quick, does things automatically, without thought, without consciousness. It lets us walk without thinking a lot about where our feet are. It lets us speak quickly without thinking about the syntax or the vocabulary, right? It lets us do a lot of things. But so that's the power of it. The peril is, once something becomes automatic, we lose control of it within ourselves. So I need somebody at their seat who's willing to read aloud something as fast as they can when they see it on the computer monitor.
Think about inputs and outputs. Who gives the input? Customer, okay. So there's another one. So you might want to do something like that, and you get the picture, all right? We're not going to do the whole thing for you. You're going to do it. Get the stickies, arrange them on the board. Don't start drawing lines yet, because that would kind of ruin the point of having the stickies there. When you think you have everything puzzled out, there might be some other details that are necessary. One of them is that there might be waiting or inventory. There may be places where the process waits. And the traditional symbol for that is a triangle. We don't have any triangle-shaped stickies, so we are going to use something like this.
Okay, a few notes on the textbook. So there is a textbook. It's not required. It's called Understanding Bioinformatics by Zvelebo and Bong. It's quite good on certain topics, but it really only covers about maybe a third of what we cover in the course. So there is good content on local alignment, global alignment, scoring matrices, the topics of the next couple lectures, and I'll sort of point you to those chapters. But it's very important to emphasize that the content of the course is really what happens in lecture and on the homeworks, and to some extent what happens in recitation.
Up until the 1960s, the Democrats were kind of a coalition of Southern Democrats, all extreme racists, and people who were very powerful because they stayed in office forever, since the South was a one-party region. You take a look at the New York Times this morning, has a headline about one-party Alabama. Everybody's a Republican, as if that's something new. That goes back to the Civil War. Except now they call them Republicans, they used to call them Democrats, but same system basically. But the Southern Democrats were extremely powerful because the senators had senior positions, you know, they'd been there forever, there was a big bloc, and they had a big effect on legislation.
The U.S. coal was very important for the world. Oil is the most important in terms of energy content. Oil's share has been declining for some time, however. You'll notice the total world consumption is growing. Oil looks pretty flat. Oil's share is declining. Oil's share is declining at the expense of natural gas. Not too surprising in the U.S. context, but the importance of coal is growing. Which is a little odd if you think about it, because coal was the first of the fossil fuels that we used to any extent, and it's now on a global basis growing. And we'll come back to that.
So there's a very interesting line of work. Dan Gilbert at Harvard is a leading figure about this idea of thinking about your future. Now, thinking about our future is a big thing, right? We're thinking about, what's it like in this course? What's it like in college? What's our friendship like? Relations with parents? What's our future career paths? What kind of life will we lead, right? Our future is something that's hugely on our mind. I mean, I think very powerfully when you're a college student or a graduate student. What's my future?
One thing that you do have to be careful of, and this exercise is actually fairly carefully designed this way, you have to capture, I actually shouldn't say that avoid unneeded details, you have to capture the right level of detail. If we just said, make the hot dog, we'd miss all of this interesting stuff, right? On the other hand, if we went through, and some people did, and that's okay because I didn't tell you not to, went through the individual, like, okay, take the order, chat with the customer, take the money, right? At some level of detail, we might actually want to do that. At the level of detail of this whole process, if we get into those individual things, it gets too complicated.
The way we handle sort of students who have to travel. So many of you might be seniors, you might be interviewing for graduate schools, or you might have other, other conflicts with the course. So rather than doing that on a case-by-case basis, which we found it gets very, very complicated and is not necessarily fair, the way we've set it up is that the total number of points available on the 5 homeworks is 120, okay? But the maximum score that you can get is 100, okay? So if you for example, were to get 90% on all 5 of the homeworks, that would be 90% of 120, which would be 108 points. You would get the full 100, you get 100% on your homework. That would be a perfect score on the homework.
Well, what happened in the 1960s was the civil rights movement broke through this. The Democrats began to pick up civil rights legislation, and the Southern Democrats simply pulled out. That's Nixon's famous Southern strategy. Let's appeal to the South and turn them into Republicans on straight racist grounds. So the parties realigned. And a large part of rural America went along with it too. That's quite separate from urban America. The lines became sharper during the neoliberal years when rural America was just smashed. Rural America meant working class, industrial America, small towns, where there's industries and so on. That was all smashed.
Okay, well, this is literally for most of you the start of your lean journey, because we've seen the value data, and we know that for many of you this whole subject matter is something you've hardly heard about. And that's perfect, because that's what this course is designed for. So welcome. So at the end of this module, we hope you'll be able to explain the origins of lean and Six Sigma, explain the Lean 6S tool. You're going to learn your first lean tool here. You're going to be able to define what is lean, what's a lean enterprise, and who are stakeholders of the lean enterprise.
So most people, first of all, tend to think about, good things, right? Which is a positive thing. Actually, I can tell you, we'll come later in the course, it's good to think that lots of positive things are happening. It's kind of a nice place to be in terms of being a happy person, right? But it turns out that people have done studies like this. So now this is particularly sensitive for a faculty member, but it could work for any sports team you've tried out or anything you've tried out for in your life. So what happens when we get reviewed for tenure? And you hear a bit about that. This was an easy study for psychologists to do. What they did is they called up people in the fall who were being reviewed for tenure.
I think we've all succeeded in doing the key thing, which is capturing the features of the process. Okay, we're going to come back to these maps, but for now, that's it for processes. Like I said, if there's one thing you take away from here, it's thinking about work as processes. Because once you think of something as a process, you can understand and improve it, often fairly intuitively. Often it really is application of common sense to the process to make it better. Okay, so a little bit of a transition now. We're going to get into the 5 lean thinking fundamentals.
Of course, we don't encourage you to skip that homework. We think the homeworks are useful and are a good way to solidify the information you've gotten from lecture and reading and so forth. So it's good to do them, and doing the homeworks will help you and perhaps prepare you for the exams. But that's sort of the way we handle the homework policy. Now, I should also mention that not all the homeworks will be the same number of points. Okay? We'll apportion the points in proportional to the difficulty and length of the homework assignment. So, for example, the first homework assignment is a little bit easier than the others, so it's going to have somewhat fewer points.
I think the most dramatic fact about the last election, the 2016 election, was not the election of Trump. The most striking fact was the Sanders campaign. I mean, the fact that a billionaire was elected, okay, it's not a big break from American history. That goes on all the time. But as the Sanders campaign broke sharply with over 100 years of American political history. I mean, if we had media that were talking about reality, that would be the headline. American elections are bought. There's plenty of substantial mainstream political science research on this. If you look just at simple variables like, say, campaign funding, something as simple as that, the predictability of electability by campaign funding is literally almost a straight line.
Mexico has a fair amount of oil. They tax it less, and other countries actively subsidize the consumption of gasoline, Venezuela being the most glaring that I'm aware of. You may ask politically, and this is the kind of question we're going to come to, how come? How come Germany makes a political decision to tax the heck out of gasoline, and Venezuela, even before the Chavez regime, makes a political decision to spend tax money to subsidize gasoline? I'm not going to answer that question, but it is a question, it is a social science of energy question, kind of a basic one. How does that decision get made?
What's a huge lesson here in happiness research, a huge surprise, is 2 things. We're kind of bad at predicting what will make us happy or sad, which is kind of weird, right? I mean, we're kind of bad at predicting it. Here's all these things where we think they would make us happy or make us not so happy. It turns out we're wrong when it's studied at all scientifically. So we'll come back to that later on, because it's a very deep thing about being a human is what makes you happy, and your wrong guesses sometimes about what does. So let me end with a last experiment. So we've really haven't done experiments until right now. And this is now a sensitive and difficult issue, which is problems we have in dealing with racism.
You essentially have a process that doesn't require a whole lot of decision making, that isn't complicated, that flows, that creates the hot dogs, that orders the buns, that cleans up the grill, whatever. The whole system is set up so that the customer desire activates the system to satisfy that desire in a way that's continuous and easy and creates value with the minimum of waste. And finally, pursuing perfection. If we can do all of this, we're not done, because we can always do better. Earl mentioned the F-18, how they identified them as a lean enterprise, and the first thing they said is, that's not true, we have so much more to do. Right attitude. They knew that they weren't perfect.
What is this project component that we've been hearing about? So here's a more concrete description. So again, this is only for the graduate version of the course. So students will, basically we've sort of structured it so there's, you kind of work incrementally toward the final research project, and so that we can offer feedback and help along the way if needed. So the first assignment will be next week, I think it's on Tuesday, where we'll have more instructions on Thursday's lecture, but all the students registered for the grad version will submit their background and interests for posting on the course website, and then you can sort of look at those and try to find other students who have ideally similar interests, but perhaps somewhat different backgrounds.
I mean, there are many special factors in the United States. Societies are different. But notice that what happened in this election, what actually happened in the 2016 election is that the mainstream establishment institutions were basically destroyed. The two major phenomena in this election were the Sanders campaign among the Democrats and the Trump campaign among the Republicans, and they were both anti-establishment. And the voters went that way. If you take a look at polling results, you can see it. I mean, anger and contempt for institutions is just phenomenal.
A lot of nuclear. France made a strategic commitment to nuclear power years ago. Those plants are very expensive. They're going to last a long time. There they are. You don't turn them off. You don't turn them off right away. Almost all the coal they use is imported. Almost all the natural gas is imported. Almost all the oil is imported. Nuclear has energy security benefits for France, which is one reason, an important reason for that decision. It also makes France a leader in nuclear technology. To come back to Everson's point about building an industry and building a critical mass, it's had that effect. France exports reactors, exports designs. A decision. But also a decision based on the fact that the natural endowment of these fossil fuels is terrible.
So today I want to talk with you about how it is that we can do research of a scientific kind for something as complex as human behavior. As opposed to things that you measure out in space or test tubes or under microscopes. People are complex organisms, right? And so to do research on them, to understand human nature, how the mind works, how the brain supports it, is a challenging story.
You know, there's some question about whether our healthcare system over-processes things. That's a controversy, but all of these things don't add value, and so you can, and they're fairly easy to spot. Unused employee creativity is often added as the 8th waste. Essentially, it's missed opportunities, right? It may be just missed work, but that, you know, if they're just not working, that's waiting. But if they're working at a sort of mental level that's beneath them, if you're losing opportunities to take advantage of the employee's creativity and capability, that too is a waste.